Hi everyone. So it is week 5 now, lecture 1, and we're going to get back to India and the state and Vedic tradition. We've already talked a little bit about these things, but we're going to be getting more into the philosophies that are born out of the early Indian state, the classical or ancient Indian state. And this lecture will not cover the same things, but kind of dovetail with chapter 8, page 169 to 175, and 182 to 189. And a lot of the stuff I'm covering today really is in that gap from 176 to 181. That's a lot of what I'm going to cover in a little bit more depth. And the reason I didn't have you read it is because I knew I would want to give you a lecture about this stuff myself. But if you want some more reinforcement of the things I'm talking about, you could fill in that gap and read 176 to 181. That's completely up to you. It will be kind of redundant. But so today we're going to be covering ancient Indian states and philosophy, Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, especially Buddhism, the stories of Siddhartha and Ashoka, founding figures in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths and the spread of Buddhism, and also looking a little bit at a couple of texts, some primary sources, some material from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, especially the Bhagavad Gita. A couple of notes before we get going. If you're sending me emails, I would really like it if you just sent me a fresh email, not as a reply to any of my announcements on Blackboard or to any other conversations, because a lot of the emails you're sending me don't have titles or subjects, and they're ending up in the spam folder. I know I said this earlier, but it's still happening, and I think I'm probably missing a few emails here and there because they're going into the spam folder or they're getting lost in these big lines of emails. So when 15 people respond to a Blackboard post that I put up, it automatically collapses those down, and I don't see your emails a lot of the time, and I'll notice it like a couple of days later. So please just send me a fresh email straight to me, straight to my email address, and in the title say what it is that you're emailing me about, maybe political history or SSH105 in the title, and then I'll be able to see it much easier. Okay, anyway, getting into the state in India and the Vedic tradition, here we have an image of Buddha, probably an East Asian image, and we'll talk a little bit about Buddha imagery. You can see the swastika here on his chest, which may be a little bit shocking. I know the first time you go to Asia and see the swastika kind of on religious buildings, that can be surprising. It surprised me the first time I saw it. It surprised my wife the first time she saw it. It's a little bit unnerving due to recent world history. This is something we talked about, I think, on the second day or third day of class a little bit. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that today. Don't be unnerved. This is not a not Buddha. This is a Buddha, and he is here to give you enlightenment, not to oppress you or anything like that. But not be unnerved by this swastika symbology, which we'll see a couple more times, I think, today, and I'll talk about a little bit more. Anyway, moving along into, I'll go ahead and get myself out of the way here, into some of the questions we're going to cover today. So, as the book states, the period of time we're really covering is 600 BCE to 600 CE. This is the time when Buddhism was the largest and most widespread, or became the largest and most widespread religion in the world. It remains quite large and widespread today, but it would shrink after about 600 CE, especially in India, and by around 1200 CE, Buddhism was pretty minor and remains to stay a pretty minor religion in India itself, in the place of its origin, which is kind of ironic, you could say. But Buddhism spreads and takes hold, especially in East Asia and Southeast Asia, where it kind of splits into two larger subsets. I wouldn't call them schools, but subsets, or almost two different Buddhisms. And we'll get to that towards the end of the day today. The questions we're going to look at is, how did Buddhism grow so fast? And where did the dozens of competing schools of thought that we see both in and out of Buddhism come from? We're going to talk a little bit about why Buddhism became more widespread than other schools of philosophical thought from India. And I mean from India there, I'm not talking about in competition with Greek philosophy or anything like that. And then finally, what were those other schools of thought, and do any others survive today? And I'll give you one example here in just a few minutes. But I want to start with some texts. I think up till now, usually when I talk about primary sources, it's been towards the end of the day, and I want to do that toward the beginning of this lecture. So I mentioned very briefly in our previous lecture on Vedic history the Upanishads as one of the major Vedic texts. It's actually more than one text. The Upanishads is many texts that have been kind of assembled together, and they were assembled together around 800 BCE, although thereafter they continued to be built up over time. And drawing here from the definition from the Georgetown Department of Religious Studies, you can see the link here, and they have a little bit more that they've written about the Upanishads. There are about 200 canonical Upanishads or Upanishads. People say it both ways. Meaning there are about 200 of these large bodies of text that have been compiled together that are agreed to belong together as within this set of schools of thought. And there are 10 really core ones. This number shifts a little bit. Sometimes you'll see people say there are 13 core Upanishads or 12 core Upanishads. Anyway, there's 10 to 12 to 13 of these, which are considered Shruti, which is to be revealed by the divine. Meaning these are texts that are essentially said to be the word of divine beings or gods. And of course, there are multiples. And these are also the oldest of the Upanishads. And so the old Upanishads come before the birth of Buddhism, while the rest, many more hundreds or 180 or 190 of them, come after the birth of Buddhism and are influenced by Buddhism. And in some ways, they are kind of like the commentary by Buddhists on the older Vedic scriptures. So as you see here at the end of this session, they are reworking a lot of the time. This last sentence is very important, that the Upanishads are highly mystical and abstract, allowing for a wide range of interpretation. And so the way you traditionally study the Upanishads is not by going out to, not by going to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and picking up a copy and just reading it. You find a master. You find someone who is well-versed in these texts, a yogi, who then reads them with you or teaches them to you. So they are as much a set of teachings as they are a religious text. And this is not, particularly unique. For example, if you go to a Christian church or a Jewish synagogue, you will be taught the scripture, right? This is not an unusual thing to be taught scripture. But in the Upanishads, because this is, maybe the main way of delivery, you are almost meant to be taught the Upanishads more than to read them yourself. So today we will look at one of the Upanishads in the Bhagavad Gita, but what you're essentially getting, because I'm the one teaching you, is the Bhagavad Gita, or this one of the Upanishads interpreted by Professor Kevin Googe, right? I am your yogi, I guess, although I have none of the qualifications to be one. And so the most famous of the Upanishads is the Bhagavad Gita. It's one part of a much longer epic that has become key in transmitting Vedic philosophy. And you can read the entire Bhagavad Gita here at this link if you want to. I don't think any of you will. You don't have to read this whole book. But if you want to take a look through it, you can. And it's quite an interesting story, and it reads like a story. The Bhagavad Gita literally means the song of the Lord, or the song of God. And it is essentially, its framework is that it is the words of Krishna, who is one of the supreme gods in Hinduism, who is himself an avatar of Vishnu, one of the other supreme gods. So it's a supreme god who is an avatar of a supreme god, giving advice to this prince Arjuna on the day of this battle that he's about to go on. And Prince Arjuna is feeling down and not sure that he's going to be successful and wondering whether or not this battle is necessary and what to do. And these are the words of this supreme being, or the supreme beings in a single avatar, to man, to humans. And I have a few quotes for you here that we'll go through in a second. But another thing you might want to watch, and I recommend this with some trepidation, and I'll tell you why in a second, is Alan Watts, a famous British philosopher and one of the early figures who brought Eastern philosophical and religious thought to the West in a mass mode for mass market appeal, talking about the Bhagavad Gita. And Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, was a champion of the Bhagavad Gita and often referred to the Bhagavad Gita regularly throughout his life in the decisions he made and his representation of India to the world and of issues that he was dealing with. And this is a very interesting lecture by Alan Watts on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, Alan Watts is one of these people who people like my parents back in the 1960s might have listened to quite a lot. He was very popular with hippies. And some of the things he talks about, a lot of transcendental meditation and things like that, come from a great deal of knowledge on his part, but they've been interpreted in all kinds of ways by American kind of counterculture people who may not always have the greatest education about the topics that they're covering, about the meditation that they're doing on Eastern scripture, Indian or Chinese, etc., or Japanese. But Alan Watts himself is, to me, a fascinating figure, and I do like listening to his lectures. And this is a good one. It's about 25 minutes long if you want to listen to it. It's a very soothing thing to listen to in the background as you do something else, like cleaning your house or something. You could listen to this lecture by Alan Watts if you want to learn about the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, to get into some of the text from the Bhagavad Gita itself, here are just 4 little chunks of it. And you can read more of these excerpts if you're interested here on the Furman website. I've just taken 4 of these, and this is just a few excerpts that they have, and I'm boiling it down even further, just to give you a sense of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. So just as the Atman, which is the soul, acquires a childhood body, a youth body, and an old age body during this life, similarly, Atman acquires another body after death. The wise are not deluded by this. An interesting teaching here. So this is talking about the cycle of life and death that we've studied previously and that I'll talk about a little bit more today, actually quite a bit more today, and that it is wise to not be concerned with your human body is definitely a part of this teaching here. Moving on to the second one, a karma yogi, which is one who performs karma marga, one who meditates on their karma, gets freedom from both vice and virtue in this life itself. Therefore, strive for karma marga, working to the best of one's abilities without getting attached to the fruits of work is called karma marga. So this is a kind of doctrine or teaching of non-attachment, which is extremely important in Buddhism, and that we see here in the Bhagavad Gita. And so this is predating Buddhism, but we see some of these ideas that are key to both Hinduism, Buddhism, and other schools, including Jainism, which we'll get to in a minute, is non-attachment. We get that reinforced in the next passage. Those who are devoid of attachment, whose mind is fixed in knowledge, who do work as servants to the Lord, all karma of such liberated persons dissolves away. So once again, you shouldn't be attached to the things you're doing in life or the things you're worrying about in life. That's what this attachment is referring to. It's attachment to material objects, attachment to your particular worries about your life. These are things that will all pass away in time and dissolve away in time, and the karma, good and bad, will eventually disappear. And then the fourth quote I have here, knowledge is better than mere ritualistic practice. Meditation is better than knowledge. Renunciation of the fruit of work is better than meditation. Peace immediately follows the renunciation of the attachment to the fruit of the work. So this is talking about a hierarchy of your priorities as a Hindu or Buddhist practitioner, and that there are kind of steps to getting out of your attachment and your troubles in life, and that these are the things you should do. So the worst thing is just ritualistic practice, just going through the motions. After that, gaining knowledge is very good. Meditating on yourself and on the world internally is better than outside knowledge. That's what this is saying, is that the knowledge you gain from yourself is better than anything you can be taught. And renunciation of the fruit of work is better than meditation. Getting rid of your attachment to things is the best thing you can do. Not worrying about the things you own, your possessions, whether or not you have a nice television or a nice car. This is the most important thing you can do to renounce your connection to the suffering of the world. And that's a key word, suffering. And we'll get back to that in a second. First, I want to talk about Jainism. Because Jainism is like the forgotten cousin of Buddhism a lot of the time when you're studying Eastern religion, Eastern philosophy, and it continues today. There are millions, I believe, of Jainists on Earth, at least a couple of million, many of them in India, or most of them in India, and it's a highly misunderstood religion. Part of why it isn't taught is because it's very difficult to understand what Jainists are trying to do. It's probably one of the most difficult religions in the world to adhere to follow correctly. Sorry about that. And the belief of Jainism is very similar to the beliefs of Hinduism and Buddhism, that you are in a world of suffering, that there is karma and birth and rebirth, and in particular that you should try to escape these things. But there are some more difficult precepts to follow in Jainism than in Buddhism or Hinduism, just considering the way you would actually live as a Jainist. Jainists, if we look at their core beliefs, they believe supremely, number one, that there is value in all life. This means everything that's alive, from human beings and animals and plants, down to insects and microorganisms, and even something like a virus would have value in its life. And so you should avoid violence to any of these things at all costs. Of course, originally, Jainists didn't know about things like microbes or viruses. But this is a very severe extension of karma samsara beliefs. A Jainist kind of famously should not swallow a fly because then they're killing something, right? And so we see here, Jainists often wear face coverings so they don't accidentally inhale any living organisms, including things they can't see. Jainists perform their prayers to reinforce the teachings they learn, not to appeal to gods. They don't believe in all-powerful gods or a singular all-powerful God, because they believe that such a being, if it existed or if such beings existed, they would not allow the world that we have here. They would not allow evil in the world. So there can't be all-powerful gods. Some people, some human beings, reach this ideal state of existence, which in Buddhism would be called nirvana, and are able to be worshipped and kind of studied as models, as examples to follow. Jainism is founded around the same time as Buddhism by Mahavira, a founder who is similar to Buddha. We'll be getting to Buddha in a minute. And so the difficult element of Jainism is how you live, kind of practically speaking. If you're not allowed to kill anything, what do you eat? Right? So Jainists live in an imperfect realization of their faith. I think that's a fair statement to say, is that they have to eat something, but what do you eat? So there's a hierarchy of what you can eat, for example, which is to say that you should never eat anything with the 5 senses. So no animals, nothing like that, no meat. There are also things with fewer senses than 5, according to Jainists. But ideally, you're a vegetarian at, at your worst. And Gianists often fast for long periods of time. You can see these are all quite skinny people. And one of the things you do is to avoid as long as possible hurting anything as a Gianist, including your food. So they often don't eat for long periods of time. They will fast regularly. And when they do eat, it will usually be a completely vegetarian diet. And the types of plants they eat will often be quite specific. Gianists also famously throughout history lived through the kindness of others. So one thing you could kind of get away with as a Gianist is if someone gives you a piece of bread or something like that, or a bowl of rice, or some vegetables, you could eat those because you weren't the one who killed those things. Someone else did it. And so you could, kind of get around the rule of not killing because you weren't the one doing the killing. Someone else was, and you could eat that. But this could only happen if it was given to you as charity. You couldn't pay for it. You couldn't buy the food because then you're kind of encouraging this act. So Jainism is very difficult to follow accurately, and it is, for that reason, it's probably not as big as Buddhism because it requires a whole lot of dedication to follow, but I think it's a fascinating one. You can read about a summary of the Jainist beliefs here, and this is the symbol for Jainism, and again we see the swastika, which I'll deal with in a second. But this is not a German or Nazi symbol. This is much older than German and Nazi symbology, and here is meant to exemplify a few things. So what things? The symbol for Jainism here includes an abode for the liberated soul at the very top, 3 paths: right faith, right conduct, and right knowledge, which will lead you to liberation from the suffering and desires of this world. And then we get to the swastika, which deals with the 4 states that your soul can live in. So the 4 boxes that form here are heaven, human, animal, and hell. So this should kind of remind you of something, right? This is similar to the 6 states of existence from Vedic teaching. It's in fact directly related to it. And then we have a universal principle of nonviolence printed on the palm of the hand at the bottom, and a piece of writing that translates to the mutual assistance of all beings. So you should help all life. So actually, in this case, this swastika, which to Westerners and to the present day world is a shocking symbol and a symbol of great violence and suffering, is in fact a symbol of how to escape great violence and suffering. This is the irony of the Nazi co-opting of the swastika. And throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia today, you will see the swastika symbol on Buddhist buildings. This is Zenkoji Temple in Japan, in Nagano, an area that I study quite a lot. And if you want to know a bit about why the Nazis appropriated the swastika, I have a couple of links for you here. I'm not going to go into more depth on it, but there is now some controversy in places like Japan about whether or not they should erase these symbols, because especially in light of the 2020 Olympics, which now may or may not happen, we don't know, but a lot of foreign people are now traveling to the East, to Japan, China, Southeast Asia, and seeing these swastikas on Buddhist buildings. And this is a rather shocking thing. And it is considered quite offensive to many people, and it's banned in many countries in Europe to even display a swastika. So to go from that reality to a reality in which temples are adorned with this symbol, this ancient symbol of liberations from suffering, is quite controversial. And you can read this article if you want. I think it's a good article. It's quite long about this controversy and what to do with it. Anyway, I don't want to get too far down this road, so I'm going to keep moving along, stay on track with what we're studying today. And I want to talk to you about the 2 major founding human figures, people who lived and died in their relationship to Buddhism and the founding and spread of Buddhism. And you could kind of take the founding of Buddhism with Siddhartha on the left here, and the spread of Buddhism with Ashoka on the right here. Siddhartha lived from about 480 to 400 BCE. It's a fuzzy, these dates are a bit fuzzy, that's why I have the tilde, the squiggly line here. Same with Ashoka, the dates are a bit fuzzy. And Siddhartha is very famous, very well known. Some of you have probably heard of Siddhartha. Siddhartha is also known as Siddhartha Buddha or Gautama Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama. And the rough story of Siddhartha is really well told here at the Asian Art Museum by this woman. And you're free to watch that. It's about 10 minutes long. And I'll give you a really, really short version of it. But essentially, Siddhartha was a wealthy aristocrat, a child of wealthy aristocrats in ancient India. He was famously born into this wealthy family and lived a really sheltered life. So he lived until his 20s, essentially without ever leaving the palace, and had only known kindness and wealth and prosperity in his young life. And his biggest concerns were kind of like the political intrigue of court and what he would do when he was king and things like that. And according to legend, one day he left the palace. He kind of escaped the palace one day on his own without permission because he wanted to see what was happening outside the palace. And there he saw kind of the suffering masses of the people who supported this aristocracy. All of the poorer people of his city, all of the kind of homeless or suffering, starving, disease-ridden people that lived outside of this kind of shining world that he had been born into. And he changed forever on that day, right? This is the legend of the Buddha. And as soon as he came into contact with these people, he became obsessed with easing their suffering and finding a way to create a world like the one he came from, where suffering was not a reality, or to find a world where suffering was not a reality and you could escape it. So he spends many years traveling around studying under religious figures, people who are versed in Vedic and Hindu traditions, those being one and the same, and kind of wanted to know why this suffering existed. It seemed completely unfair to him. And after many years of study and many failures, trials and failures of ways to escape suffering, he sat beneath a Bodhi tree, and for many days, I think the legend is 49 days, but it varies, and then reached an enlightened state of nirvana. There are some sects of Buddhism that believe in this moment he transcends his life, transcends existence, and others, and more commonly, that he continued on living in our world and continued to teach others in this enlightened state. So he becomes the first bodhisattva in that second case. A bodhisattva, we'll talk about a little bit later today, is a human being who reaches an enlightened state, but either, depending on the sect of Buddhism you're talking about, either decides to stay on earth, or you just stay on earth because that's the reality of the world, and on your death you'll go to nirvana, or you decide not to ascend to a higher plane of existence and stay here to help others. So bodhisattvas are these saviors, these saints of Buddhism. That's the rough story of the Buddha, Siddhartha, and his influence is immense. He is the founding figure of Buddhism, but there is a second figure here in Ashoka that we should talk about, especially from a historical perspective, in terms of why Buddhism spread so widely and as much as it did. Because in reality, Buddha was one of many people, including the founder of Jainism that I talked about a few minutes ago, around this time, who were seeking philosophical and religious truth, and who were offering this truth oftentimes to great powerful leaders of the many Indian states that had existed. And Ashoka was an emperor of the Maurya dynasty and a conqueror of most of the Indian subcontinent. So he wipes out a lot of these other statelets or settlements, all these other leaders throughout India, and thereafter converted to Buddhism. He kind of chose as his philosophical style or lifestyle Buddhism. And so after all of this death, all of this warfare, all of this killing, Ashoka is essentially seeking penance by turning to religion and religious philosophy, and spent the rest of his life, much of his life, promulgating Buddhist teachings, both kind of by traveling around and appealing to others and learning and teaching and gaining the teaching of philosophers, and through things like the Edicts of Ashoka, wherein he made Buddhism a state religion. He makes Buddhism a kind of political policy. So a lot of the foundations of Hindi politics come from the Edicts of Ashoka, which, they're Buddhism in origin, but later Hinduism and Buddhism are kind of always intertwined until at least the 12th century, and even after that. If you want to read the Edicts of King Ashoka, I have them here for you, archived. I know it's another old-looking website, but this is the best version that I've found in text form. And as you can see, it's quite a long set of edicts. But essentially, the Edicts of Ashoka were a political policy that mirrored the spiritual beliefs of Buddhism and attempted to employ them on a political level throughout the Indian subcontinent and the empire of Ashoka. So these are a very worldly text, meaning they're known in the Greek and Chinese worlds, the Edicts of Ashoka. So even beyond the borders of India, we start to see the spread of Buddhism, thanks to Ashoka's political power as the leader of this large empire. It pains me to make this so quick, but I do want to keep moving along. I'm sure experts in other areas would be just as pained by my other lectures. So we'll go ahead and keep moving through this into Buddhist beliefs themselves. The foundational set of beliefs in Buddhism put forth by Buddha himself are the Four Noble Truths. And I'll talk about these for a couple of slides here, but my version of the Four Noble Truths, I just wrote these up, is number one, that life is suffering. Number two, the suffering you have in life is caused by your desires. Caused by your desire for worldly things, for your position in life, for success, avoidance of failure, for everything else, for food, etc. And that number three, you can eliminate this desire. Desire can be eliminated. You can get rid of it. Number four, you do this by following the Eightfold Path. And we'll worry about the Eightfold Path in just a second. But I want to talk about the first three of the Four Noble Truths to get started here, because this sounds kind of miserable, right? Why would this be appealing to people? And it is difficult to understand for us as modern people living in a wealthy country, in modern Americans, to even agree with these first two is to almost go against modern capitalistic life, right? Life is suffering is not something we accept as a truth today. And that your suffering is caused by the things you want is not a truth we accept today. This kind of flies in the face of consumerism and the way we often live in America and in the modern world in general. So to understand the Four Noble Truths, it is important to put yourself in the mindset of a pre-modern ancient person, especially a very average person, perhaps a lower class person, a farmer, a crafts person, etc. If you approach the Four Noble Truths from that perspective, this makes a lot more sense. Because if you're a farmer who's dealing with plagues and crop failures and famines, and you're living, 2,500, 2,400 years ago, me telling you life is suffering is no piece of big news. Like, you already know that. That's definitely true. You're already dealing with this suffering day in and day out. And so me telling you that there's a way out of this is kind of a lifeline. I'm throwing you a life preserver. So if you accept the first one or two of the Four Noble Truths, that life is suffering and that suffering is caused by all these things you want, then the other two, the last two of the Four Noble Truths, seem much more appealing. And let's make a quick comparison here. I'm not going to open this link, but I was looking for an image of ancient farmers, and this is an early Islamic depiction of farmers. I think it was from around the year 800. I might be wrong on that. You can click that link and you'll find out. It's a good article about this. But if you look at this image of these Islamic farmers, these Muslim farmers, they have halos around their heads. They are godly people. They are the ones doing this suffering for the rest of us, right? And this is the same belief you see in Buddhism, that there is a holiness within you even if you are suffering, and that you can still find happiness either in the next life or in escaping this wheel of suffering, this great wheel. Remember from a few lectures ago, great news about this wheel that Buddhism is offering is that there's this way out, as I've already mentioned earlier in the course. But I thought this image was quite useful because it shows this concept of farmers as holy people and of the lower classes as still being holy people exists in other religions as well. And we'll see it later in China and Japan too. So getting back to the basic beliefs, we have the Four Noble Truths rewritten here. I think this is a good infographic for the Four Noble Truths. And then the Eightfold Path is explained here. We have right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And so there's this whole tree of things you can do to help escape your desires and therefore help you escape suffering. And this path, it's complicated. There's a lot more to it, but there are a lot of basics to it. Don't steal, don't kill, don't lie, don't take intoxicants, no sexual misconduct. And the Noble Path, the Noble Eightfold Path here is very complicated. There's a lot to it. You can read about it on your own. But this set of ideas, and my question here is, why would it gain such traction? It's kind of the explanation I already gave you, that both it was politically promulgated by Ashoka, and it has mass appeal. It doesn't really take a lot of scholarly thought and scholarly dedication. You don't have to have a life of a scholar, which is really a limited group of people, a rather rich group of people, to be honest, who are able to sit down and think about philosophy directly all day. You can kind of get right to the heart of the matter of Buddhism with the Four Noble Truths, and it's pretty quick and easy to explain. So it spreads like wildfire across Asia, essentially. A little bit into Europe, but mostly throughout Asia. Buddhist belief spreads all over the place. And we'll talk about that spread here in just a minute. But I want to keep talking about the ideas of Buddhism and Buddhist cosmology for just another minute here. So there's another piece of good news, which is that you, and yes, even you today in 2020, have been born relatively close to the time of Buddha. And this is cosmically fortunate, because the closer you are to Buddha, the fewer generations between you and Buddha, the better to understand his ascension, his ability to escape suffering. So there is both a vertical cosmology to Buddhism, which I'm not going to talk about at all, which is here on the right, and a horizontal cosmology of Buddhism, which is much simpler, and I'm going to talk about a little bit. Which is that based on the belief system you're working with in Buddhism, it's essentially always the case that there's one day going to be another Buddha, but it may be a very long time before you see another Buddha. And the earliest that any Buddhists believe you're going to see another Buddha is about 5,000 years apart. So us today would be about the halfway part. This is the halfway point. This is kind of actually the Dark Ages. In waiting for the next Buddha, which is believed to be someone called Maitreya, who is a bodhisattva themselves. Don't get too worried about all this. I know I'm getting off into the weeds here a little bit, but especially Theravada Buddhists, which is the Buddhism of Southeast Asia, the belief is essentially that in the next couple of thousand years, a new Buddha will be born. They will be called Maitreya, and they will bring a new Buddhist law to our world, so a new set of teachings. And we'll have another chance, all of us, you and me, to become enlightened. Others believe that this is a much more rare occurrence, that it might be millions of years between Buddhas appearing in the world. And so you and I are already very lucky to be only about 2,000 or 2,500 years away from Buddha, because that's a minuscule amount of time in comparison to this cosmic timeline of millions of years between Buddhas. So you could see the appearance of new Buddhas as a straight line with a few thousand years in between, or as millions of years in a circle where the circle is so huge that the line doesn't look like a circle. It looks like life is just going along. All the people before you, all the people after you are living their lives and nothing repeats itself. But you're actually on this great circle where a new Buddha, who might actually be the same person, is born again a few million years later. And this also ties into samsara and rebirth. Anyway, it's good news in either case that you're born around the time of a Buddha. So how do ideas travel? Getting back into the practicality of the movement of Buddhism. Number one, who exports and imports and exports these ideas, and why? Well, lots of people, right? For the most direct, you might see someone like Ashoka traveling throughout the Indian subcontinent and spreading the Buddhist belief through both politics and philosophy. But in addition to those, to monks and priests, etc., priestesses moving around, spreading the word directly, we also see Buddhism moving with things like trade. So if you look at maps of the Silk Road, they're the same as the maps that we see Buddhism moving on. We see physical barriers like the Himalayas, blocking movement of Buddhism on land, and so people move through Central Asia and the Gobi Desert, North Central Asia, into China, and then down into Korea and Japan. We also see seaward routes into Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Cambodia, Vietnam, that area. And this movement is happening both deliberately through priests and monks moving around, moving back and forth. It is rather famous that monks would go on long pilgrimages to spread the word, but also kind of without a direct purpose of spreading Buddhism, by people who have that faith moving around and establishing new sites of worship as they go. And a very famous one we'll see is in Mogao, the caves near Dunhuang, which we will maybe look at next week, I think, when we get back to China. And these are very interesting places along the Silk Road. And as we talk about the Silk Road, we will also talk about more about the spread of Buddhism. What other ideas spread with Buddhism? First of all, we have scientific knowledge. You can look at page 187 for some of that. Knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, knowledge of medicine, which is kind of within that. And knowledge of the world itself, of geography and culture, and the map of the world starts to fill in, especially in the East, as we see Buddhism spreading alongside other knowledge and goods along the Silk Roads, or the Silk Road. So all this stuff moves together, and it's kind of interrelated in its travel. Talking a little bit more about Buddhism in the Silk Road, we've already talked a little bit about why Buddhism was popular in other parts of Asia, but less long-lasting in India, but this is a good link for that. Essentially, Buddhism is one division of Hinduism, and the Hindu faith gradually overtook Buddhism. It wasn't really a singular moment. It was that Buddhism dwindled down, kind of shrank down in its popularity in India as it boomed in places like Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, etc. In India itself, Buddhism dwindled down. You can see some differences between Buddhism and Hinduism here, and this is a good little set of comparisons. Somebody just made this, but I agree with it. And then there are two big kind of sets of Buddhist beliefs that develop as Buddhism spreads. So the spread of Buddhism also shapes it in its own right. We have Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle, which is the popular sect or set of beliefs in Buddhism in East Asia, Tibet, China, and Korea, and also in Vietnam. And Theravada, the teachings of the elders, which is more popular in other parts of Southeast Asia and moving further into oceanic or into the ocean of Southeast Asia. In both cases, we see bodhisattvas, these enlightened people who continue to spread the word. In Mahayana Buddhism, they remain on earth to help others, whereas in Theravada, they generally are seeking enlightenment first for themselves, and then they might return after their death to help other people. They're both still charitable sets of deities, and there are actually thousands of them. But in Mahayana, they remain in their human form as they are bodhisattvas. You can be a human being and a bodhisattva at the same time. And in Theravada, that's generally not the case. In Mahayana and East Asian Buddhism, there are lots of ways to get enlightened. We'll see some of these developing in places like Japan and China, kind of like Zen Buddhism, which is meditation-based, service-based Buddhism, where you help others and you become enlightened without a lot of philosophical worrying, through study directly of scriptures, and through worship, also through worship of the Buddha as kind of a god. There are famously sects of this in both China, Korea, and Japan, where you might chant something on your death, and regardless of the other things you did in life, this is much later on, this is around the 10th to 13th century this starts to develop, where you chant something on your death and you are enlightened just by doing that. You might say the Buddha's name over and over, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, over and over and over again as you're dying or in life, and that might mean you are saved by the Buddha and enlightened. You might say Namo Renge Kyo. There are multiples of these that appear. And so we see a lot of chanting, meditation, and mantras in Mahayana that comes along with this. And Theravada, by contrast, emphasizes self-learning, inward meditation and study on your own, and critiquing the scriptures, trying to kind of find your own truth within these scriptures, is much more prominent in Theravada in Southeast Asia than in East Asia. And silent meditation is therefore very common. Silent meditation also exists in East Asia in the form of Zen, but it is kind of more of the singular form of meditation in Southeast Asia. We see certain sects appear like Pure Land, Zen, Tantric, and Meditative Buddhism in Mahayana in East Asia. We see the Thai forest tradition and Vipassana meditative Buddhism in the Theravada belief system. You can learn about these on your own if you're interested, if you want to study them. Like with all other things in the course, you do not have to learn more about these. But understanding that there's this kind of shift where there are two kinds of Buddhism that really, two major kinds of Buddhism with little schools within them is important, and they start developing pretty early on. Some bodhisattvas become almost as important as Buddha. This is significant. Some of them are often depicted as females too, so Buddhism is not strictly the domain of male deities or male enlightened figures. There are multiple female deities or enlightened figures. One of them, perhaps the most important, especially in Japan and China, is Kannon or Kwannon. Has lots of names. These are some of the names for this figure. Kuan Im in Chinese, or Guan Yin in Chinese, Kannon in Japanese, and some of these others that I don't even know how to pronounce. Kannon is especially known as the goddess of mercy. So she is someone you pray to when you need mercy, you need help in your life. So as a bodhisattva, she is perhaps even more equipped than Buddha to help you in your actual life. Buddha's trying to get you out of your life, right? He's trying to help you transcend your life. Kannon is going to help you in your life, in your study, things as simple as, will I pass my driving test and get my driver's license? There's a deity for that under Kannon. There's a function of Kannon for that. You can see her many arms here. And my favorite of the Kannon figures that I've seen is the one at Hasedera, which is a very big popular tourist destination in Kamakura in Japan. And this is made of wood. It's one of the largest, it might be the largest wooden sculpture on Earth. I'm not sure. I think they claim something like that. I'm not an expert on wooden sculptures. And there are entire areas of research that revolve around these deities. So is Kannon female or male? Sometimes Kannon is depicted as female, sometimes as male, often as female in Japan, especially recently in the past few hundred years. But you can see this is an incredibly detailed article, and this is really just an encyclopedia piece about Kannon and her meaning and her existence and the beliefs around her. And this is just one bodhisattva, but she is a rather prominent one, to be fair. Anyway, I'm going to cut this off here. I know I've gotten fairly detailed, but I wanted to fill in the gaps in the text today. I think this is an area that I know some things about, and I thought I would give you some insights rather than making you read this chunk of the textbook. For next time, we'll have a mini lecture on Thursday. I'm hoping to actually keep this one short, maybe under 30 minutes, about object analysis and material culture, and just talking a little bit about Leora Oslander, that article, which is now online in our documents folder, that I encourage you to take a quick look at, maybe read the abstract as you get closer to working on your object essays. You don't have to do it this week or anything. For the 31st, discussion leaders should post your questions based on today's readings and also today's lecture if you want. For the 2nd, you have this lecture on objects that I just told you about. And then for the 5th, you're going to have the discussion due for the rest of you who are not discussion leaders. And this week, thankfully, I hope for all of you, there is no short response. It's nice for me to not have to grade it. And we'll just have the discussion this week. And then I believe next week is our break. Let me confirm that really quickly. I'm sorry for the wait here, but I believe next week is in fact our break. And so we'll have a week off where you can continue to keep up with the work, but I probably won't have anything up right away. And yeah, so we have our spring recess. We'll have one lecture on classical Chinese philosophy next week, and then the spring recess, which I will observe. I won't have you do anything during that period of time. I know you all need to go ahead and catch up as this break has caused a lot of disruption to your classes and your work schedules, as I've said before. So we will go ahead and take this break, and then we'll get going again on the 21st. But yeah, we have one more substantial lecture, which will be kind of like today's lecture, but it'll be on classical Chinese philosophy, people like Confucius, who you may have heard of, and we'll talk about that next week before the break. All right, everyone, so that's it for today. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.